As I was getting my plans together for this spring's prepping projects that I want to get done, one of the things on the top of my list was getting a fallout shelter of some kind. I don't have a basement, I don't have a bunker, and of course, fallout shelters are on the top of everybody's mind right now because of the threats that we face in the sense of a global conflict. So I wanted to do some research and find some DIY budget-friendly fallout shelters that at least would do the rudimentary job of protecting my family from nuclear fallout. And I live in Minuteman missile territory, so there's a good reason for me to feel like this could be a reasonable threat for me to face. So, what did I find? Well, in 1962, the Department of Defense put out a handbook called Family Shelter Designs, where they give a whole bunch of instructions and parts lists and everything else you would need in order to build DIY fallout shelters that should do the basic job of protecting you from fallout. Now, we'll go through all these shelters really quick just as a overview, but just so you're aware, many of them start with having a basement, and then they build these shelters within the basement to provide maximum protection from fallout, because just the fact that you're in a basement doesn't always mean you're fully protected from that. But there are other options too that are above ground or even just semi-mounted. So there are some things that you can do even if you don't have a basement, like me. So these are all things that I'm working on, and I think a lot of people are on the same page, and I figured I would share this information with you. But there's one prep, and there's one thing that you need to get now before they just suddenly dry up, because if everybody starts building these shelters, I'm telling you right this second, when nuclear fallout becomes a universally accepted threat, these are going to disappear quickly or become very expensive. And I'll tell you about those here in just a minute after we go over some of these fallout shelter designs, just to make sure we're all on the same page as to why this would be a problem, okay? So let's start with the basement-based shelters, because if you do have a basement, these would be easier to accomplish and they would give you maximum protection from fallout rather than just being in your basement. So maybe something you would be interested in. And these are all designed back in the 60s, so some of the terminology is a little out of date in the sense of some of the materials being used, but either way, they should do the job, because back then everybody was very concerned about the same exact things happening. And if you're worried about the idea of nuclear fallout being a real threat for you and your family, then hit the subscribe button below, because I guess I'm one of those people now too. All right, so the first one that they offer is the basement sand-filled lumber lean-to shelter. And basically what they do with that one is they fill a wooden box with sand and then seal it up and then lean it up against the wall, and then you hide underneath that in order to stay away from the fallout. Because as we know, compacted dirt and sand is very good at keeping out radiation, nuclear particles, which basically is a lot of the recurring theme here when we discuss these different types of shelters, okay? Then you also have the basement corrugated asbestos cement. Probably leave the asbestos part of this out if you do this exact shelter, but basement corrugated asbestos cement lean-to shelter, which is kind of a similar idea, except for they take like a quarter of a giant steel culvert pipe, right, that's corrugated, and then lean it up against the wall, and then they cover it with sandbags. So there's a lot of different ways to approach this, but they're giving you a lot of different ideas based on what might work best for you or whatever materials you have access to or whatever that is, okay? Another basement one is the basement concrete block shelter, and this one's a lot more reasonable in the sense of planning and the idea of actually just being sturdy, right? You're basically building a cinder block box in your basement that should help protect you from nuclear fallout. So these are basement designs that are better if you already have a basement, of course, but also still DIY and budget friendly. I thought those were all reasonably interesting and that you should be aware of those. Now, really quick, I do need to mention this channel's biggest supporter is Midway USA, and Midway USA does a ton when it comes to preparedness, and honestly, this is one of the things I got from them, which I know you're very curious about. So if you're worried about what's in the bag, make sure you guys hit up my subscribe star, because I'll tell all of my subscribe stars about this first, because when that eventual video comes out where this will be featured, there's a good chance they might run out pretty quickly. So make sure you sign up for Subscribestar if you'd like to see that kind of stuff, as well as have access to a lot of other things. And then big thank you to Midway USA. Now, what are some of the outside fallout shelters that are part of this DIY project planning thanks to the Department of Defense back in 1962? Well, these are ones that I was interested in because, like I said, I don't have a basement, and these are actually, at least in my opinion, a little bit more feasible than some of the other designs I've seen out there, because not all of them require very much engineering skill, right? Which is something I don't really have a lot of. So the first one is outside semi-mounted plywood box shelter. And this is basically where you semi-bury a plywood box minus like the very front of the box and Mostly it's buried about halfway up or maybe, you know, 3/4 of the way up. And then the back of it's buried further, but then you leave the front of it exposed. And then this plywood box, which is obviously supported and reinforced with things like 2x4s and whatnot. But either way, it's buried in order to protect itself, and then you just clog the front up with sandbags once you get you and your family inside. So that's one of the designs. They have the below ground corrugated steel culvert shelter, which is obviously going to be a little bit more difficult to put together because you have to fully bury this one, but the steel culvert corrugated style of shelter is very similar to what you see with, you know, newer modern companies like Atlas Survival Shelters, where they take the round steel culvert because basically it can handle a lot more pressure because of its round shape. So that's one option as well, but probably one that's a little bit more invasive than some of the other options they have here. Might be one of the more protected ones as well, though. You got to keep that in mind. It's all a compromise, right? Then they also had the outside semi-mounted steel igloo shelter. I'm not really sure how that one would work. It's only partially buried, and then with the design, and you put dirt on it, all this kind of stuff. That one I wasn't really interested in because it seemed like one of the more complicated designs just because of the fact that it's an igloo, right? Whereas that's just something that not a lot of people are good at just building, right? So this is something that is there, it's available, but I think some of the other designs are a little bit more DIY friendly, at least if you're asking me. And then one I was really interested in that I thought was very achievable and reasonable for somebody with a limited amount of engineering skills, and the fact that the materials are probably not that hard to source, is the above ground earth covered lumber A-frame shelter. And this one I liked a lot because basically you just make an A-frame out of lumber and then you bury it, and then it's still above ground, and you just clog up the entrance with sandbags, and then you call it a day. Look, these explanations are extremely simplified. I'll give you a link down in the description as well as in the pinned comment for the actual plans so you can look at them yourself. I wanted to provide this resource for everybody just as a way for you to kind of have access to the same information in case you're considering some of these things as well and you're not really sure how to approach it. Of course, there's tons of designs and tons of shelter kits and tons of companies out there that could do this stuff for you. But if you're on a budget and you're decently capable with your hands and you're just not really sure how to approach this, this might just be a good place to harvest some ideas at the very least, right? And then the last one on the list was the below ground new construction clay masonry shelter, which is the most obvious one in the sense of being like the best one because it's literally just an underground bomb shelter that you build, right? So I thought that one was, you know, it gives you the plans and the ideas of what to do in order to build it correctly, but it's the most obvious thing. If I want an underground bomb shelter, I'm just gonna buy one and pay somebody to put it in or whatever, because that's not as DIY or as budget friendly as any of the other options I already discussed. So yeah, that's a good idea and that's what I want and that's what I think a lot of people want, but I don't think it's as achievable as some of these other ones, especially that above ground earth covered lumber A-frame shelter, just because it's easy to get into, it's easy to build, it's easy to bury, there's not a whole lot of excavating and other stuff that has to happen. And yeah, it might not offer as much protection as some of the other options, but if you want to have something that's better than nothing, and at least something to get started with, maybe that's a good option. It's one that I might be looking into. Either way, these are all things we should be considering right now. Now, what's that one prep that you really need to make sure you have plenty of and that you get ahead of time before everybody on the planet realizes they also want a fallout shelter, and then they start figuring out, well, what can I do that's on the cheap that I can build myself because I don't really have any money and all I can really do is, you know, use my own hands. Well, obviously, almost every single one of these shelters, even the basement-based ones, require sandbags. You need sandbags. These things are gonna go away or get really expensive really fast if you don't get them now, because you can just order a ton of them right now and of course start filling them with sand or whatever you got, or you can also buy pre-filled sandbags, which is gonna be really expensive and heavy, but either way, get sandbags now. I mean, they're good for a lot of other things too, right? You can use them to create water barriers, and you can use them in order to create, I don't know, like a foxhole or whatever else you want to do with sandbags, but I think they're a good thing to get before everybody starts trying to build their own DIY fallout shelters, where sandbags are basically a requirement of all of the shelters that I just discussed with you, besides like the below ground construction style ones and the ones, well, I mean, pretty much all of them require them, in all honesty, because you still need a way to clog up whatever entrance you're using, and most of them aren't using some kind of door or anything like that. They're just expecting you to layer up sandbags once you get in behind yourself. So I would get a bunch of sandbags now. Even if you don't have plans to do something with these shelters or anything like that in the immediate future, they might still be a good thing to acquire now in case you need them for any other purpose. In case there's floods, in case you want to build some kind of a pillbox or something, I don't know. But all I'm saying is that sandbags, I think we should get them now before it's too late. And hopefully these DIY shelter ideas gave you something. Like I said, the link is in the description as well as in the pinned comment in case you guys are wanting to get this report or this handbook yourself so you can kind of see some of the plans and the materials and everything else. But I just thought this was good information to have, especially based with everything that's going on right now, right? I'm trying to talk like a million miles an hour right now for no reason at all, other than the fact that I've had 17 cups of coffee. So besides that, that's gonna be it for Magic Prepper.